We believe you. We honor and affirm your experience. And for the next 90 minutes, we're welcoming you into a safe space. Safe, but not without challenges. Our community is here for inspiration, honesty, and accountability to end gender-based harassment and bias. We're going to present 6 perspectives on a way forward and amplify the voices of those present here in the Brick House Ballroom who've weathered both an emotional storm and a snowpocalypse to be here this evening as we, in partnership with Womankind and Rabin Impact, present this BHeard Town Hall. MeToo is just the beginning. Speaking of the beginning, there's a woman who's been bouncing around Brooklyn for a number of years, and we were fortunate enough to know her before she went viral. But for all of you who have just met her or continuing to get to know her, I want to introduce you to Tarana Burke.
Greetings, everybody, and first I want to thank BRIC TV for allowing me this opportunity to deliver a message to this group in advance of this event. I really wish that I could have been there because I would love to take part in a robust conversation about the Me Too movement. But in my absence, I'm glad I'm able to have you as a captive audience for at least a few minutes to talk about the work that we're doing and to really help people frame and understand what the Me Too movement is. I think that with all of the media attention that we've received and all of the focus on #MeToo, there has been very little understanding about what the movement actually is. And so it's important that we dispel some of those myths and some of the misconceptions that exist, because they are right now barriers to us doing larger and more expansive work. The misconception that this is a movement about taking down powerful men, or that this is a movement that is about, white, famous, cisgendered women in Hollywood, or this is a movement that's just for women, all of those are misconceptions. And I think that it's really important for us to understand that this is a movement for and about survivors. Our sole goal is to center survivors and to make sure that they understand that healing is possible, and to help survivors to craft a healing journey. And that means making sure that they have the resources that they need to do that. It is also a movement that is about community action. And so it's about us providing also training and leadership development for survivors and for advocates and allies, so that they have the tools necessary to go into their community and affect change around sexual violence in their communities. Everything else is a distraction. And I think in this moment it's really interesting that people, particularly people in our community, will celebrate me as an individual and celebrate me and recognize me as founder of the Me Too movement, but also say things like it's leaving out Black women, or it's leaving out any marginalized group. From my perspective, you can't have it both ways. You can't. If you acknowledge me as the founder of the Me Too movement, that means you acknowledge the body of work that existed before the viral moment, and you acknowledge the movement as it has been framed by the work that we've done. If you celebrate me as the founder but say that marginalized people are left out, that means that you are engaging with this movement through the gaze that the media has given you. You are engaging with this movement through what corporate America has told you that it is. And so we can't be left out of something that was created for us. And that's what this movement was. It was created for and by Black and brown women, for Black and brown women. And over the years, it has expanded. We have expanded our scope. And so our scope is first and foremost marginalized people. That means queer and trans people. That means people of color. That means disabled people, people who are marginalized in various ways. That is always our first focus. But beyond that, our overall focus is survivors. This is a survivors movement. And so the conversations should be around not who's being left out, but who is right here in front of us. We've had millions and millions of people to engage with the hashtag, to engage with the movement in the last 5 months. And we are not talking about those people. We're still talking about perpetrators. And I'm not talking about the media, I'm talking about us. The conversations we have are about the perpetrators. The conversations we have are about who's being left out, as opposed to how we can take ownership of this thing that exists, this tool that we've been given. And so I hope that the conversation today really steers in that direction. I hope that the focus is on the reality of the movement. Nobody is being left out. This is a thing that is open, wide open for anybody. If you feel like you only are included if you're validated by mainstream media, I think that's problematic. I think that we have to be validated by each other. I think that our stories being told to each other has to be enough. And I think that we have to focus on the work that has to happen in our communities to interrupt sexual violence more than who outside of our communities are validating whether that violence is happening or not. I hope that makes sense to people. I hope you have a great conversation today, and I hope to be a part of more community conversations moving forward so that we can set the record straight, so that we can frame this issue in the way that it needs to be framed, and so that we can be about doing the work of interrupting sexual violence wherever it lives. Thank you.
And thank you, Tarana. We are most definitely about the work of interrupting sexual and gender-biased violence. To that end, we've invited 6 extraordinary people here today who are going to come at an authentic approach to getting past MeToo into what's coming next from their unique perspectives. They're survivors, they're advocates, they're people who are in the fight, and here they are.
As the head of a government agency, I want you to know that you have rights. And in New York City, you have a lot of rights. You have one of the strongest human rights protections nationally, and we want to use that. It's really important for people to continue to hear your stories. People have to know and understand how sexual harassment happens, where it happens, and that it affects everyone. Everyone in New York City has rights, regardless of who they are, who they love, how they identify, what they believe, the color of their skin, or where they're from. We need to hold people accountable. So we need your help doing that. We need to make sure that people in power and privilege are held accountable for sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based discrimination. But to do that, we need your help. So report it. Thank you.
As a survivor, as a healer, as a social worker, and a community organizer, I'm here today to remind you to continue to lift voices of survivors. I'm here today to remind you to make spaces for survivors and to follow their leadership. As a woman of color growing up in America, undocumented for most of my life, I have been silenced in many spaces. And when you add sexual violence to that mix, that pool of being heard gets even smaller. So this is why I'm urging you to listen, to be silent, and to listen to survivors who have been silenced. There are many other identities that we're going to talk about today that have continuously been silent, and I urge you to listen to those voices. Thank you.
As an activist and also as a man doing this work, I think for many of us as men, this is an opportunity to finally say, we're gonna get off the sidelines and do something about what's happening. Because our silence only excuses the behaviors and attitudes associated with sexual assault and sexual harassment in our communities. Doing this work for a long time, I can also tell you that for me, it's been a transformative experience, because doing this work and being part of movements toward ending sexual assault and harassment and violence against women, I've also found the opportunity that I needed to say that I can say me too. And that saying me too doesn't have to be a vulnerability for me. It could be a sense of strength to help other men who may be sitting with that inside their bodies for years until they're ready to speak up. And I want you all to understand also that rooted in accountability, we can find an opportunity for healing for all. And that's what I want to say tonight. Thank you.
I'm an attorney who fights for the rights of immigrant workers. I myself am a daughter of an immigrant from Mexico who came to this country with nothing and had to work her way to where she is today. So I grew up with a struggle, and now I'm fighting the struggle in a different capacity. There is a need in this city and in this country for a safe space for immigrant workers to talk about sexual harassment. And they're not doing that because they're afraid. They're afraid of bosses who are exploiting them, stealing their wages, stealing their dignity, their health and safety, discriminating against them, and sexually harassing them. They're afraid of deportation, and it's not helped by the current president's policies attacking immigrants. If we really want to allow immigrant workers to talk about sexual harassment, then we need to take a lead from worker centers and unions such as the Laundry Workers Center or Workers United, who support workers' rights, and build leaders, teaching them their rights, and having them feel that there's a safe space for them to talk about things that are happening to them at work, especially when it comes to sexual harassment. Thank you.
As a community organizer, the work to me is about reminding people of our power and our responsibility to keep each other safe. We can't rely on institutions, the police, the military to look out for us and to protect us, because history has shown that that doesn't happen, especially if you're a person of color, if you're queer, if you're a woman, if you're femme. And so the work as a community organizer is about people power and reminding us that it is our duty to protect each other, and it is our duty to develop practices and strategies that are rooted in love for one another. We all have the power and the potential to cause harm. And so in recognizing that, it is our duty to deconstruct that within ourselves, within our communities, within our families, and to tear down the walls and the barriers between us. And I organize with the Safe Outside the System, which is a grassroots group that is under the umbrella of the Audre Lorde Project. And we're a group of queer and trans people of color that work here in Brooklyn to work with business owners, community members, other people in the movement to develop community-based strategies around safety and intervening in violence, because it's only us that can liberate us. Thank you.
As a philosopher, I think our most important goal right now is to reconceptualize what normal is. We need a new normal about what sexual pleasure should be like and what our workplaces should look like. One of the things that has really gotten in the way of people being able to hear the testimonies of survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment has been the thought that, well, this sexual harassment and sexual assault are normal. And in a certain way, people say, well, this happened to me, so it must be normal, it must be okay. So on one hand, the first part of that is right. Many of us have experienced sexual assault and harassment. I have. They are very normalized in our society. But the second part of that is the part that we need to work on. Just because something is normal in the sense of happening often doesn't mean that it's okay. So we need to ask ourselves how we got into a place where in our society it seems normal that it's just a condition of a woman being in a workplace that she has to put up with and even sometimes accept sexual advances. We need to ask ourselves how we got into a situation where it's normal to have one's own sexual desires discounted. And we need to ask ourselves how we got into a situation where it's normal that some people's sexual pleasure is supposed to count more than others. So part of what I think is really important for us to do as part of continuing the work of the MeToo movement is for us to think about a new normal and a world in which both sexual pleasure and equality are normal. Thank you.
With consent, it's hard for women because, I was always a very modest person, and I felt like the first night that I did get assaulted the first time, I had on like a t-shirt, but it kind of had a little see-through, and I was like, oh my God, it was the t-shirt. I should have never wore that t-shirt. I should have never, and it's ridiculous.
And the question becomes, I didn't say anything because I was in a room filled with other folks. I didn't stop it, but I didn't want it. So to what extent are we consenting? And I think the bigger question also is, who decides what consent looks like?
The HR representative provided me no blueprint for, next steps. The conversation ended with her saying something along the lines of like, you really need to get used to this happening.
I remember when I was working in finance, experience that happened to me, and I remember thinking, if I speak up, I'm going to be the one who's fired.
All men need to do is just ask what it's like to be a woman in this world. Just stop for 5 seconds, think about it.
Yeah. It just comes down to empathy.
Yeah.
They push abstinence and then they push safe sex. So it's like, if you're gonna tell me about safe sex, you gotta tell me everything that's involved with sex.
What was that we had instead of gym?
The health class?
Yeah.
We learned basically like the biology part of it.
Yeah, we didn't learn like the regular basics.
If you want us to be safe, make sure we know what's going on, like give us the knowledge, you know?
It's because they think we don't need a sex ed class, because in my opinion, I feel like people think, okay, all we have to do is give boys condoms, tell them use the condom and the girl won't get pregnant. And with girls, they tell us don't have sex and you won't get pregnant.
Those are just some of the voices from our community talking about their experiences. And you just heard some very interesting voices. Allow me to reintroduce them to you one more time. I'm going to start with you, Ashley Eubanks, an activist fighting for people of color and the LGBTQ rights through radical community-based strategies. Thanks for being here. Across from her, Serene Khader. She's a political philosopher working primarily on feminist issues in global justice. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Also, Juan Ramos is here. He's an anti-sexism activist working to engage and educate men, boys, and communities about gender-based violence. He comes to us from Los Sures. Thanks for being here. And we're also happy to welcome Maria de Cruz, who provides spaces for people of color looking to discuss trauma and practice community care with bodywork and mindfulness. She's from Womankind, our partners. Thank you for being here. And Maria Chickdance is an attorney representing sexual harassment, wage theft, race and gender, and discrimination cases, specifically in immigrant communities. Thanks for your work. And she is New York City's Commissioner of Human Rights, and she's joining us live here. We're happy to welcome Carmelyn Malalis. So I'm going to start with you, Commissioner. I'm looking at you right now. We saw Tarana Burke talking about keeping authenticity in the movement and centering the voices of victims. And survivors is really what they are moving forward. So I wanted to know from you, listening to what she said about making sure we keep our focus, how do we walk the walk and not be changed by what we see in the popular commercial media about what the MeToo movement means?
You know, I think as with many other things, representation is so important. Which is why, you know, as the movement has been unfolding, I think it's been really important for us in government, or specifically at the New York City Commission on Human Rights, to make sure that people weren't just thinking of this movement based on the faces that were being popped up so much in media or in social media. And so in December, we actually held the city's first public hearing, citywide hearing on sexual harassment in the workplace. And it was the first hearing on gender discrimination that New York City has had in 40 years. And the real aim of it was to get people to come and testify from the industries and from the experiences that you don't really see. So domestic workers, people in low-wage work, people working in utilities, tech workers, folks working in offices, but just the diversity of different experiences that we know experience sexual harassment on a daily basis. Those stories really needed to be put out there front and center as well in a venue and with a medium that allowed their voice to be heard and said to government, listen to me, hear what I'm going through, and this has to be addressed. We wanted that to be the center of the narrative as well. So for us, it was about creating these spaces where their stories could be told and where their experiences could also be out there in the world.
Well, there are a number of people sitting up here among you six who've been creating spaces and doing the work before viral activism was even a thing that people talked about. So looking past this like hashtag activism, what does it mean to walk the walk in the Me Too movement?
So for us, I'm a member of the Safe Outside the System collective here in Brooklyn, and it's really about responding to violence and responding to issues that arise, and also like turning to community. So for us, it's like, how are we responsible to each other, and what are ways that we in our everyday lives can shift that and recognize the power that we have to shift that in our families and within ourselves, and to really challenge that and not rely on and there is a space for us to have like lawyers and people in government supporting, but it should not be their responsibility, and we should not expect for the type of work and movement that would need to happen to come from them. It needs to come from us. And so the work for us looks like, how are we building with each other? How are you talking to your neighbors? How are you knowing what's going on in the apartment next door? And how are you bringing down the things that divide us and tell us that's your business? And I know that there's violence happening, or that there's something happening on the street, and that is separate from me. How do we see ourselves reflected in the people that we encounter?
So as we sit here tonight, this is the end product of a very long road that was internal here, where even we all had different approaches and saying, no, this is what the movement means, this is what's next, this is what we're talking about. And we invited all of you guys. So I wondered, what is the venue where the 6 of you might have been together if it wasn't here on a snowy night in Brooklyn? When do you get a philosopher next to a commissioner, next to some lawyers and advocates and people who are on the ground doing work? So where are those spaces that we may not have entree to, that we hope our thought leaders and community folks are meeting and engaging in?
I have no idea. I was going to say that I think a lot of the spaces are happening really informally, actually, right? Like, they might not be official spaces. They're people's, like we were talking about church basements earlier. They're happening in church basements. They're happening in people's living rooms. A lot of times organizing doesn't happen in these really official venues. So I think a lot of the networks that end up building organizing happen really unofficially, but I think maybe some of the more activist-y folks will mention some more official spaces.
Do one of you activist-y folks want to take a crack at that one? Looking at you guys.
Well, I think, in particular in working with men, I think that you have to find spaces where men congregate, and sometimes those spaces aren't safe for you to have those type of conversations. So you have to find ways in which you can introduce the conversation in a way where men don't feel like they're being indicted, that they're actually being invited into a conversation. And I think that's key into working with men. You also have to think outside the box. What are some of the ways in which we can engage men on the issue, right? So there are a lot of men that love saying, I'm a good guy, I don't do any of this. Well, the reality is, from the perspective that I see it, is that those of us that consider ourselves good guys, we're just as bad as the bad guys, because our silence, toward their behavior only excuses their actions. And until we start doing something about it, having the conversation, and kind of, getting it from the earliest roots of it, right? We all, as men, have been socialized to think about ourselves in relationship to women in specific ways. How do we deconstruct some of that socialization? How do we kind of think outside the box? Because the more we box ourselves into a specific way that men should be, the more I think we're going to seem like we're in a prison. And for me in particular, being invited, to be part of movements where women invite me in, not for me to show up and say I'm taking over, but for me to be there as an observer and actually hear, this is how I'm impacting women. Right. Because in order to do something about it, you first have to hear how you're impacting someone. And then from there, begin to do the work, again, not to take the lead, but to support and to say, I hear you, I see you, and what can I do to support you? And I think for us as men, at the moment, with the MeToo movement and all other movements, as men, we kind of feel like there's a spotlight on us right now, and that's very uncomfortable. We need to find a way to make it comfortable to have the conversation, because I guarantee you, a lot of us will find that we're sitting with stuff that we also need to get out. I know for me, it was very transformative, as you heard me say. I sat with things, in me for a long time until I was ready to say something happened to me, and it happened at the hands of a man. And I need to do something about that.
So knowing that we are in a transformative moment, how do we respond to that? How do we respond to a story like Juan's, knowing what the headlines are when we see men in these powerful offices exerting their will over people who are their subordinates.
You know, I think what's so special about this time is that there's actually a call to action. You know, I think a lot of people would dismiss this as a moment of awareness. And what's been really powerful, I mean, this has been going since, what, October, if you think about like the resurgence of MeToo. And it's really about action. It's about movement. I think that's so much of what's behind this. For those of us who are old enough to remember, I mean, in 1991, we saw Anita Hill grace possibly every screen in the United States talking about sexual harassment in very vivid terms. And sadly, I think that was a moment where people were kind of frozen or paralyzed, you know, with their TV screens, just kind of watching this unfold, and there was no call to action. And I think what's amazing about right now is that it's a movement. And part of that is, what is the call to action? So that means, you know, as Juan was saying, you know, what do I do as somebody who might be a bystander in a situation where this is happening, or somebody who might be implicit in a situation unfolding? What are the steps that I take within my community, you know, as Ashley was saying, or within my company? What policy changes am I moving forward? So I think what makes this time very special is it's about action. It's about taking action and seizing the day, which is why as a government agency head, part of the action that I hope people engage in is report it. Report it if it's happening to you. Report it if you are watching this happen to someone else. And frankly, this is also the reason why I, as a government head, am so happy that we have all the different people we have here in the community. Because the people reporting it, they need to know that they're empowered. They need to know that they have support. They need to know that there are other people behind them when they're taking that very crucial and vulnerable step in coming forward.
Maria, what about the people who are not reporting it, who are not stepping forward, these workers who have become the pariahs of our current political situation? How do you give them the power to step forward and say no more?
Well, when you think about the space, by the time somebody comes to my office, that person is already felt safe enough to come forward. So it's not typical that somebody would come with, an immigrant would come to my office and talk about sexual harassment. Immigrants typically come, workers to come about wage theft. They'll talk about wage theft, or they'll talk about safer topics, which they're still afraid of, by the way, because coming forward, especially if you're not documented, and being told that you could be deported at any moment just for being here, it really dissuades people from even coming forward with any type of case, but especially when it has to do with sexual harassment. So by the time somebody gets to my office to talk about what happened to them at work, that's already a giant leap. So the reason we work with worker centers and unions that organize their members, which are mainly immigrants. And it's through that organizing and through worker leader training and worker training that they're able to create the safe space to get people to actually tell their stories. And one of the workers centers that's actually here is the Laundry Workers Center, and they build leaders and they try to really create these safe spaces for people to tell their stories with respect to sexual harassment. Because it's a difficult topic for anyone, but especially somebody who's afraid for reasons that might not be typical to the average American.
So Maria, I'm looking at you now, listening to Tarana talk about keeping the voices at the center of MeToo, and knowing now that if you turn on any award show, you're going to see somebody up there representing MeToo that is a world away from any situation someone who you might interact with is in.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of specific folks that I work with. Not everyone, or we put a lot of onus on survivors to do something, right? To react, to respond, to report, but we don't put a lot of onus on the community. So not all survivors want to report. Many of the folks that are assaulting them or are violent are in their families, in their communities, part of their religious institutions, schools, all of these spaces, right? So not everyone wants to report, and many reasons of whether they're undocumented or any sorts of other reasons, right? So we need to also think about listening for a second, and that's a lot of the work that we do is listening to survivors. Like, okay, what do you want? What do you need out of this? What can I do? These are some of the resources I have. What makes sense to you today? Tomorrow you might change your mind, and that's completely okay, right? So we need to continuously do that and ask those questions and just stay back and listen. Because not everyone is ready for that, and that's completely okay.
So what does it look like when the community is involved? When someone does take the step forward to say, this has happened to me, what is our response, and how do we as a community amplify that voice and give them some kind of resolution?
So a lot of the work we do, one element of the work that we do is rapid response. And so if an incident happens in Brooklyn, in central Brooklyn, and it has to do with like a queer trans person of color, a lot of the times we're contacted, and other comrades we have that like are also doing this work with queer and trans people of color are contacted, and we reach out to the family and the person who was involved in the incident. And it's always about them leading and us supporting them in whatever solutions they want. And like, how are we centering, like she said, like how are we centering survivors, and also showing that we're here, and like and those are the spaces, honestly, I was thinking about your question, when do we all come together? And moments of rapid response, we're like, okay, do you want legal support? If so, we have connections. Do you need healing? And like, what other, like, and most people need healing. It's like we need a holistic approach. So how are we healing people? How are we bringing in the resources that they want? And also understanding that, yeah, there's a lot of times if it's family members or people you know, that it's scary to go through those systems. Those systems also take a long time. And a lot of the times, sometimes they like open up fresh wounds, and there's also a lot of sharing and resharing, and like a lot of times those systems like cause more violence against the person. And so how are we producing other options to folks and riding with them along the way, and not just in that moment of focusing on the person that caused harm, but also like, what do you need? What does your family need?
So, the Commission on Human Rights, we have a community relations team that oftentimes will work with organizations like ALP in situations like that. So as you're coming to figure out, what are the basic needs of the person or the community harmed, our community relations team can work with folks on that level to make sure that we're being attuned to, again, needs of the community at that moment in time, needs of the individual. My background is not dissimilar from Maria's in that, my background's as a lawyer, and before coming into government service, a lot of the cases I worked on were sexual harassment related. I was an employee advocate. And so for me, I'm still always constantly thinking about how we use law as a tool. And so part of that for me is also putting out there in the world that even as we're working with community and the survivor on the harm of the moment, also letting folks know that here in New York City, we also have the ability to initiate investigations on our own at the Commission. So you're absolutely right. There's oftentimes situations where people are not ready to report it. They don't want to put themselves out there. And there could be a host of different reasons why that may be, right? It could be because, they're still getting over the trauma of the experience that they have just experienced. It could also be that, their relationship with government hasn't been fantastic. Maybe they're from a community that's been overly policed, overly surveilled. Maybe they felt like government's never been there for them. That's something we completely understand at the Commission on Human Rights, which is why we say to the organizations out there, you tell us about it. You give us the information that we need so that we could investigate those claims on behalf of the city, even without somebody coming forward and putting their name on a complaint, because we still have that objective of keeping those people accountable who have caused that harm and of stopping the harm so it doesn't happen to somebody else. And the other point I want to mention is that, in New York City, one of the most powerful things that we have is we also protect our immigrants regardless of what their status is. And a very specific provision that we have under the city human rights law is immigration status. So if people are being targeted specifically because somebody thinks they're undocumented, and oftentimes it is the case where employers think to themselves, this person's really vulnerable because what rights do they have? And I want everyone here to know that in New York City, you have rights regardless of who you are or what your status is, because we specifically protect against discrimination based on immigration status. in the context also of sexual harassment.
And that's a 311 call away?
Yep, that's 311 asking for human rights or calling 718-722-3131.
All right, so at this moment, I'm going to remind the audience that we're going to be taking questions in just a moment. So if you do have something that you'd like to ask of our panelists, you can make your way to either of these aisles. But in the meantime, I'm looking at you right now. We were listening to the commissioner, and she was really talking about structures that are in place right now that keep some people victimized and can empower them from the city standpoint. But I want to talk to you about changing the way that we are culturally. That has to do with structures as well, but giving realization to the fact that structures can be changed by people.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking this question because listening to both of you guys, I think we spent a lot of time talking about what we do once somebody has already been victimized. And of course, that's really important to talk about because there aren't enough resources available for victims in the status quo. But part of the call to action also has to be about how we prevent this from keeping happening. And this doesn't just, I mean, we've had a lot of attention on perpetrators as part of kind of the mainstream lens of the MeToo movement. But I think it's also important to remember that this is made to seem normal because of really simple everyday interactions that happen in our lives and in our workplaces. So I think a responsibility that everybody in the room could take on would be to look around their workplace at the small things that happen that make sexual harassment seem normal. Like you might, the next time you hear, for example, a group of men getting together and rating the attractiveness of the women who are working in your office, like this is not a totally separate phenomenon from the phenomenon that ends up leading to sexual harassment. So a small thing like refusing to participate in that conversation, changing the subject, repeatedly changing the subject when that's the kind of conversation that comes up, that's also how we do the work of prevention. I also just think, I mean, this is not only a workplace issue, but another thing that's, I mean, important about changing our culture is changing our understanding of what it looks like to be a professional and what women and other marginalized people in positions of economic power look like. Because part of what sexual harassment is used to do is to keep people out of the workplace and to keep them feeling subordinate in the workplace. So part of what we need is also images of what it looks like for women and also other marginalized people to function as equals in the workplace. Because I think we'll spend a lot of time talking about sexuality, and that's a part of this. But the other part of this is that sexual harassment is used to keep people economically dominated.
So Juan, looking at what Serene just said, I'm struck by one point of the potential for people to be interrupters in these cycles and systems that give rise to problematic things later. So how do you become an interrupter in a situation like what she just talked about?
I think that starts with creating standards in our community. But in order to create those standards, you also have to create consistent conversations around the issue. Because, you know, we can be reactionary, like sometimes we are, to something that happened to someone I know, something happens to someone that's connected to someone that I know. So it becomes personal at that moment. Right. But if we set standards in our community where we say this is unacceptable and continue to have those conversations on an ongoing basis, I mean, just think about it. If men in our community, for example, were told on a daily basis at work, at church, you know, when they go shopping, and everybody's having those conversations, then it becomes something that's normalized. Right now, it's easy for us, you know, again, going back to what I said earlier, those of us who consider ourselves good guys, I don't do that, right? Or at least I don't do it in front of people, right? To say I'm the good guy, point the finger, and that's it. I don't have anything else to do with it. But it's really about how do we get off the sidelines as men, begin to have interaction and conversations with men in our community, and begin to show them that they need to be part of the solution in order for this to end. Because, you know, we've had movements that where women, not only with sexual assault, but, you know, everything from domestic violence to all forms of violence against women. There have been many movements, but those movements continue to resurge in our communities for a reason. And that's because we as men haven't taken them seriously. We haven't seen that we're part of the problem and we need to be part of the solution. The other piece I think that we really need to look at is the fact that wherever there's a survivor or wherever someone's been violated in any way, that we really need to begin the process of saying, I see you and I hear you. And that means that, you know, before a woman or anyone that's been assaulted in that way ever receives justice, they're already put on trial. And that we need to kind of cut that out and say, what's happened to this person? How can we get them assistance? But also, how do we, you know, create a situation here where they're not indicted before they receive justice, right? Because it almost seems like they've been violated and they have to go through this whole process to prove that somebody's done something to them, right, as opposed to being heard and being seen and also being told, I'm with you, I'll stand with you. And I think that that's something that we have to normalize more in our communities, because right now it's easy to say it's not my problem, or I didn't see it happen, or, you know, I make sure that I don't talk to those guys who act that way. But the reality is we walk that very thin line as men with each other, in relationships and families, in our communities. But walking the thin line makes us just as complicit as the person that's committing the...
So speaking of that thin line and even walking the line, we're at this moment, since you pointed out earlier in October when this hashtag went viral, we're moving into a space now where the backlash has already started to happen. And there are some prominent men who are using their voices to say, this is becoming a witch hunt. You can't say, hey, you look good today, without being called in front of HR or being threatened to lose your status or your position. What's our argument back the next time you hear something like that? Anybody?
You know, I would say a few things. One is, I mean, of course, what happens in situations where people are being held accountable, people often deflect. This is not a new strategy. We've seen this before. We see that when we raise the issue of racism, of white supremacy, of any of these things. People deflect. They say it's not about us. It's about what people are being overly sensitive. People are creating a witch hunt. So, I mean, strategy-wise, I don't think that the kind of so-called backlash that some folks are pointing out is you know, a kind of a genuine criticism of what's happening right now in the movement. I think, too, there's also the reflection and the recognition that we're talking about behavioral changes not just in the workplace. We're talking about behavioral changes in life, on the street. Yeah. You know, and I will say that the Commission on Human Rights, we are very privileged right now. We have, for the first time in our history, we're able to have an artist in residence. And we are working with an artist by the name of Tatiana Fazlalizadeh, who I think some folks probably know. She is a very gifted artist and muralist who started putting murals around streets saying, stop telling women to smile. Really kind of calling out and addressing the behavioral issues that we see every day as women, every day as people, walking around the world with everyday, you know, catcalling or gestures of degradation or humiliation. So we're not talking about just what happens in the workplace. There's a continuum of what happens on the streets or on the sidewalks in our communities and then going into the workplace. We can't expect that, you know, learned behavior or habits are just going to stop once somebody comes into the workplace, and we can't be surprised when that behavior continues into the workplace. So I think that critique is, you know, is frankly short-sighted, and it's really not seeing the big picture.
I also want to recognize the folks from Holla Back who are tabling outside and in the audience tonight for the work that you do around this very issue, and our community is the better for having you guys in it, and we're certainly better for you being here this evening. So looking at that perspective, do you even have any words for those folks? You're in the business of keeping people safe outside of the system, making sure that we're accountable to each other without looking to some officials that we have the power.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have too many conversations with cis men, especially I don't care to spend my time engaging in that. But I would like call upon other like comrades to like talk to them. I think that when we're talking about violence, it's important to recognize what violence is and then what critique is. And if someone is misinterpreting a critique as violence, they should interrogate that. And if someone is being called out for being violent, and it's more important for them to like defend themselves in that moment than to hear how they've hurt someone, that is a problem. And so if someone was telling me that I had caused pain or hurt, then I would want to hear that. My initial response would not be to be defensive. And so I think that is important to like highlight, and maybe that can help someone in having that conversation. And it's important to like think about all the ways that violence exists. And so the work that I do is for queer and trans people of color and gender nonconforming people, and even like erasure is a form of violence. So when we're having these conversations in ways that are binary, and we're talking about only men or only women in these cis ways, when we're erasing people and people aren't visible and they're not validated as human beings, which so often trans women of color, gender nonconforming people are erased. And then if they are seen, they're the ones who are experiencing on a daily basis harassment and violence, and they're the ones who are completely excluded in many ways from the workforce, and so and from the economy. And so like those are forms of violence as well. It's not even just like someone commenting on your appearance, but like how do people tell you that you should not exist in this world because of what your gender identity is?
So before we toss to a video that we prepared for you guys, I want to ask you, what happens to the broader society and a movement when the voices of people who are marginalized, when gender nonconforming folks are not centered in a movement, or at least acknowledged at the very least?
Well, I think what happens when we don't center the voices of marginalized people is that either the problem doesn't get solved or we get solutions that are directed at the wrong problem. Part of what's so powerful about MeToo is it says, listen to the people who are affected by these problems. You might think that you are being witch hunted or that they are overblowing these problems. But if you think that, how would you know if you're not the person who's affected? So, it's really from looking at how the people, because the people who are affected know, right? People who are marginalized understand often what is happening to them and understand much better than the person who's dominating them. So if we want social change, we have to take seriously the voices of the people who understand what the problems are.
We also have to take very serious the voices of people who are young and just entering this society such as it is. We're going to be the future change makers. To that end, we met two interesting young ladies, Janae and Navila, and we had a conversation, a tough one, with them, where they did with each other, about consent.
Even from little girls, we're taught, don't go outside too late, don't wear your skirt too short, or don't do this, don't do that. Why is it that we're automatically kind of taught like you're unsafe if you're by yourself as a woman, but as a male, they don't really have to have that?
The idea is same or similar with regards to don't be alone. And for me, I also have the factor of being Muslim. Right. So with that comes all these religious practices about, don't mix with with the opposite gender. And when it came to the conversation about consent, that was never taught. Right. It was more so of this silent understanding of don't interact and engage with the opposite sex. Yeah. Be careful of how you portray yourself, because you will be perceived as a sexual moving object, right, despite you being literally a 6-year-old child. Right.
So I just want to point out the fact that those ladies are here tonight, Janae and Navila. I see you back there. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your voices. We definitely appreciate your honesty. So I happen to know that some of you are parents here tonight. I'm looking at you, Maria. Invite us to your kitchen table right now and let us know how you are raising your children. I know you have a boy and a girl, with respect to the differences between boys and girls and how to make them good citizens.
Well, I have a boy and 2 girls.
Okay.
And the boy's the oldest, he's 5. And then my 2 daughters are 3 and 1. Oh. So the 1-year-old, she's still small, but they really are they're really things that are already stereotypes at that age where, and I try not to let it be from home. Yeah. I would really, I'm assuming it's from school, but sometimes there are things that kids just pick up on. But what's really important to me is that my son, when we talk about MeToo, as somebody raising a boy, it goes without saying that I want my daughter to be safe to talk about experiences through anything that would make her uncomfortable, anything that would be important for her to say. Right. But it's really equally important that my son understand that as well. So these are conversations that for a 3-year-old maybe will evolve, but there are conversations that will always include both, or all 3 of them once the 1-year-old's older. They're family conversations, not I need to talk to my daughter about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and how people should touch her or talk to her. It should be both of them understanding, because I think it's going to be really important for my son to be somebody who speaks out against that when he's older. And, you know, it's going to happen pretty soon. He's already 5.
So Maria, tell her she's doing everything right. How do we begin to change the culture with young people as young as 5? I imagine that's a good point. By the time you get to high school, Juan has a little more work to do.
Yes, and you're doing everything right, and there's not enough resources to support you to do that work, right? So if we do know organizations or spaces for parents that are focusing on how to raise children, how to raise boys, how to raise young girls, then we need to support those spaces, right? Yes, and to follow up on your question, which was...
We've both forgotten the question already. No, I'm talking about creating spaces for parents to sort of get through these insidious little messages that are being thrown at kids all the time, unaware that they're even taking on these gender norms and things that may turn out to be bad for them when they come into their consciousness.
Yeah, and that's sort of what you have brought up before, is about changing the culture, right? And changing the culture and how we have these conversations. So it's not just about like, oh, like you told me to smile, like I'm feeling this way, and that person reacting defensive, right? Going beyond that, like this is part of a bigger culture that's violent, and yes, you hurt my feelings and whatnot, but I'm letting you know that this can create a bigger issue. So changing culture is definitely part of the prevention work, right. And wherever there's folks that are doing that work, we need to take a pause and listen to how they're doing this work.
There's a guy who's doing the work right across from you. So Juan, how do you carry out this function with the call to men?
Oh, you know, being a part of a call to men is unique on its own. I really came into a call to men as a young man. You know, I'm 43 now, and I started doing this work with them when I was about 20 years old. And
You're
being
almost
exposed
done.
to them, yeah, and being exposed to them for me was uniquely an opportunity also, because before that, you know, I thought my manhood was rooted on how violent I can be, how intimidating I can be, how I dealt with all the vulnerabilities that I carry inside of me in ways that I could mask through that violence. Everything from, you know, it led me to the streets, to gang violence. It led me to, you know, again, embracing violence as that unique opportunity, not to deal with my vulnerability. So deconstructing that and working with young men is very important at an early age, because for me, like I said, the transformation that happened was being exposed to conversation. You know, this is the first time I show up to a job, and Ted Bunch, my mentor, who was one of the co-founders for Call to Men, and he says to me, well, come into my office. And he did this every single day in my first 2 weeks. And he's telling, well, we work with women here, but I need you to know who you are as a man in relation to the women here. And this is how we treat women here. And we listen to the voices of women and how we impact them as men. For me, you know, I wanted to quit after the first week, you know, but I wasn't exposed to that. So this is why we need to start early on to deconstruct some of the socialization that we carry as men. Because if you look at, you know, some of the men that are now being held accountable, to undo the socialization of all those years overnight is hard. You know, so we need to start early, but also understand that when we do the work, regardless of what age the man is, that once they know, they can't say they don't know. And that we can't let go of the accountability that has to take place as well. Because I believe you can treat whatever's happening to you, you can work at any issue that you carry with you, but once you're informed, it's your duty to respond to that information in a positive way, not only for you, but for the people that you impact, the people that you engage every day. And as a father, I can tell you, I have 3 boys. Yeah. And for me, you know, I have a 21-year-old, I have a 21-year-old, a 26-year-old, and a 13-year-old, 12-year-old going on 13. And every day I say to myself, what can I do differently in order to give them the message that as men, we can do better. As men, we can treat women with respect. But I also know that that means that I have to be an active parent, because every day they walk out the door, I know they're getting 1,000 messages that are going to contradict what I'm saying. And I have to be ready, willing, and able to, that when they get back home, I'm creating that space to have that conversation, because I also have a daughter who's 17, and I know I'm going through changes right now because she's about to go to college, and looking at the statistics, instead of me rooting for her to get through school and get her degree, I'm also rooting for her to be one of those people that doesn't have to call me and say, Dad, I'm one of those statistics.
On the speed of that, Juan, I'm gonna ask you, how do we have that conversation with men that makes it real before it happens to their moms or their daughter, where the world and the way that people relate to women is real and impactful to them before it comes and knocks on their front door?
I think one of the ways we do it is honestly by, again, going into community, making the conversation something that is not happening based on something that took place or someone being impacted by it. The conversations in our community have to be more fruitful, they have to be more intentional, we have to create the spaces, and even if those spaces are small in the beginning, you know, the fact that they're taking place, other men can say, well, maybe I can listen to that. Or, you know, we talked earlier about the men congregating in the office, saying something about the women and saying that there's a witch hunt. But the reality is that what those men are doing is basically, it's an emotional kind of plea with other men, like, are we really this bad? You know, like, for them to kind of connect in the face of we're being held accountable, we don't know what to do with it, we've never been in this position, how do we even support, or how do we say we want to create change? Because now we don't know what, nobody's ever held us accountable.
Well, we have a question right here.
Hi, I'm unfortunately going to have to change the subject a little bit, which is unfortunate. But my question is, I'm just wondering if any of you can talk about affordable legal aid that's available to survivors of assault or harassment in New York or nationwide. I just know in my work and my research, I come across a lot of survivors who would love to, who are, say, failed by the criminal justice system. They would love to file a civil lawsuit, but they simply cannot afford attorney's fees. So I'm just wondering what's going on, what's being done about that here or elsewhere.
All right, I'm gonna just pause for a second so people can grab a pen, because this is a news you can use part of it too. So where can you go for affordable help?
So
you can go first.
Okay, I would say call the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission on Human Rights was actually created as a forum for people without resources. There's no filing fees. There's no need to have an attorney with you. People call the Commission on Human Rights if you have a claim. You will end up speaking with a lawyer at the Commission on Human Rights. So you'll have a city attorney that's representing your claim on behalf of the city. I think this is an area where it's really tough. You know, legal services exist in the city for many different issues. Sexual harassment claims are by their very nature pretty resource intensive because they can be long, they're so fact-based. So there are the ordinary legal services like Legal Aid Society, for instance, that would take these types of claims on. But I think in terms of like reaching out to the private bar, it's probably very difficult to find folks who would do this, you know, either completely pro bono or who, you know, when they're looking for cases, if there's not like a sure win, and I feel like in these situations, it's very rarely the case that there is a sure win, that's not being extremely selective about the types of cases they take. So one of the reasons that I was so happy to come into public service and into government was I had now the ability to serve, you know, such a wide array of people and folks who didn't have resources. So some of those cases that I had to perhaps turn away when I was in the private sector, at the Commission on Human Rights, I can say, call 311, ask for human rights, call 718-722-3131, and your claims will be investigated by an attorney, you know, from the government, from New York City.
And I also wanted to add, as important it is to have an advocate, that's a legal advocate, it is also important to have a friend or an advocate or counselor, whether it's a therapist, to walk you through that process, because it can be emotionally draining, it can be dehumanizing. So if you have someone that you care about, someone that cares about you, that wants to walk you through that process, talk to you over the phone, whether to go to your appointment with you. Womankind provides free legal service as well. and has advocates in sight. So wherever that resource can take you, but to also make sure that someone's walking with that person.
And also, sorry, just as the private attorney, you know, that people call our office all the time with so many different types of cases, and really the real question is, if there is a case, then whether we're in a city, we're in New York City. I don't know. There are probably the most attorneys in this city than any other city in the world, I'm assuming. And many attorneys take cases on a contingency basis, even if they don't do it pro bono. So, which means that it's just they're not charging you the hourly rate. They'll whatever they recover, they get a percentage. And a lot of attorneys in this city operate under that type of agreement. And you know, and as somebody who practices, we have different types of agreement depending on the type of case and the type of plaintiff. So I would definitely tell your friend to call attorneys and do research, because she's not completely shut down because she can't afford to pay an attorney's fee up front.
I would only add that you should also, you know, encourage people to get to know their local community-based organizations who have advocates and, you know, people who are from the community, because sometimes you have people who are afraid of systems and afraid to go outside their community to receive services, because, and talking from the work that I do in particular in communities of color, we tend to think a couple of times before we go outside our community to seek help, because it doesn't always benefit us in any way. So getting to know your local based organization that's doing the work and advocating can be a way of receiving support, but also finding that you can have someone walk the walk with you, basically.
All right, thank you. We have another question. Come on.
Hi, sure. Thank you for hosting this and being here. I know there's been a lot of talk about sort of micro-level efforts and changing culture and everything, but I was wondering what you all recommend in terms of changing policy. So whether that be legislative on the city, state, federal level, but also corporate policy. What are some things that you would recommend that either we as viewers or people in the audience can do to take to stakeholders in our communities?
I would say one of the first things that I think we need to do is create a situation. In particular, if we look at local politics, local policy, create a situation where organizations that are on the ground doing this work don't have to plea and beg for their funding every single year. You know, and that there's something in place that makes it continuous for them to receive that funding that's necessary to bring it closer to the people that need it on the ground. I think that's a huge policy shift that we need to make, because often when you're talking about policy and you're talking about you know, the city's agenda, for example, those are on the cutting block first, and those are the people that sometimes are vulnerable and sometimes don't have a voice other than those advocates who need that funding to do the work on the ground.
So, Commissioner, I got two words for you, persistent and what was the other one? It's persistent, the laws that you guys have instituted in the city. I know your office is a two-headed approach where you are advocates, but you're also in a policy and legislative agenda.
So, I mean, in the last 3 years that I've been the Commissioner for Human Rights, we've been doing a lot of work, especially in areas where we think you know, cases or claims have been under-enforced, or areas where there are gaps in the law. Legislative changes are huge, and you know, in the past few weeks, we've been working with the City Council on possible changes to the law to make our law, which is already pretty powerful, more strong and more accessible to folks, so that these types of claims would be easier for people to raise. Some of the things that we're looking at are things that have also come out of the sexual harassment hearing that I said we had in December. So some of the things folks raised are things that, you know, we could look at, like changing the statute of limitations. So rather than a one-year statute of limitations coming to the agency, people would have a 3-year statute of limitations, similar to what people have if they want to file in court. People have also raised issues about, you know, what happens to people who are working in smaller environments and environments where there tends to be more isolation, like for instance, domestic workers. Currently, under the city human rights law, there needs to be a 4-employee minimum in order to raise a claim of sexual harassment. So what about situations where we could perhaps change that or look at adjusting that to recognize that, you know, some folks like domestic workers who are not in situations where there are 4 employees are also very vulnerable to sexual harassment. And then thinking through also like trainings and workshops and policy changes within businesses or within employers, and having them reflect on the fact that, you know, it is hard where there are situations where there's only one reporting mechanism within a company. The more types of people that could be, you know, tapped as EO officers or access points to report claims, usually the better. Trainings should perhaps also include some sort of element of bystander training so that folks know, even if they're not the victim of sexual harassment in the workplace, what should they be doing as somebody who is trying to interrupt that sexual harassment or be an upstander rather than just being a bystander? I'm still constantly disconcerted by the number of people I talk to who tell me that they work in environments where there's never been any sort of EEO training or training on, you know, how sexual harassment or any other type of discrimination manifests in the workplace. So I think pushing for some of those things is key. And frankly, I think also empowering people in your city to speak up, to run for things, to push these things. As we see on the federal level, the local level is the same by whoever is in power. That's also who's going to be at the heads of your agencies or the heads of your government structures and pushing for these laws. I don't think I would have been appointed as the chair of commission or the commissioner of human rights by possibly some other mayors. This is a mayor that believes very much in gender equity and pushing for human rights. Yeah. And so who you vote for matters.
I just want to, I know you had a follow-up, but I'm looking at you, Juan, wondering about knowing how the home is not legislated in a way that the workplace is, and it can be the most violent place in your entire world. So bridging that gap between a safe space and outside, some people might be only able to breathe when they are at home. How do we bridge that gap between outside world and making home a non-violent place?
I think one can't go without the other, right? Again, you have to set up conditions in the home that are going to impact what you encounter in society and vice versa. Because, you know, again, behind closed doors, a lot of things happen. Right. And sometimes you have people living with these things for years, and it's not until they get some form of freedom that they're able to talk about it or meet that person that can help them. So again, I think that both things need to be working simultaneously, where there's a big push in our communities to put this out front and center, and that we have these conversations, that people know about the things that are out there to help them, the laws that are out there to help them, but also that, you know, as human beings, you know, because that's the one thing, you know, that we've lost in all of this, which is our humanity. The way in which we treat each other is, you know, not just with sexual harassment, but overall. If we were just to examine some of that and kind of redo things, right? That's what we've lost, our humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, in a place where there's humanity, there's seldom not respect, right? So we have to practice that. And for a person who's living suppressed in a home through any form of violence, including sexual assault, domestic violence, those people are surviving day to day. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you know, the resources that they encounter in their community means a lot. Even if it's someone that gives you that card that says, "Call me when you're alone. Mm-hmm. I can help you." If they're picking up pamphlets at their grocery store, you know, on the issue. If when, you know, as men or women, we go to the barbershop or the hair salon, there's information there. We have to be intentional with putting this in front of people's faces and believing that we can transform and create change in that way, and not continue to wait for someone to say, "I need help," and then we send them to a secure location. Right. Then, you know, we have to be out front and center, say no more. This is where we're going to change all this.
So I'm looking at Maria and Serene and you, Ashley, now. What does that look like? This sort of radical honesty and acceptance and healing, especially on the end of that, where we have a survivor who's getting what they need. What do we do with the perpetrators? What happens to these men? Are they thrown away? What's the path to reconciliation to be brought back into the community and made whole again? Is there one?
I think that there has to be. There has to be. And so we ground our work in transformative justice, and which is different than restorative justice. Transformative justice believes that like, as I mentioned before, everyone has the potential and has in their lives caused harm. So and everyone has the potential and has experienced harm. So if we're moving forward from that and understanding that, and there are people who cause more harm than others, there are people who experience more harm than others because of their identities. But if we're moving forward in that way, it means that we really need to work through, like, how do I cause harm to other people? Like, how am I perpetuating that and like passing that on to other people in small ways and large ways, and for us, a lot of that work has been like, how do we create spaces where people can talk about that? How do we give people actually the skills and the tools to like intervene in violence? How do we role play? We sit in our basement and we like invite people and we're like, give us an incident of something that happened on the street, and then we figure out together how do you intervene. And we like really work through it together and we try things. And they might not work and sometimes they do work, but it's actually like, how do we embody these practices and figure out together the ways that we can like stop.
So just give me an example of trying a thing, put a name to it. Yeah, we're gonna try some things. What does that look like?
So a lot of stuff happens on trains, right? Gotcha. And say, for example, a lot of the conversation is still falling back in like men and women and how are men perpetrating violence against women. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of gender-based violence that happens to people that do not fit into these ideas and structures of what we call men and women. So if you see something happening on the train or in the street where someone is like being harassed because of their gender identity, what are ways that we can intervene? If you see like stuff is escalating, how do you put your body in the way? How do you address the person who is causing the violence or address the person who is starting to escalate? And how do you like question them or pull them into a conversation and deflect that attention away from the person who is experiencing the harm? And how do you notice moments that can escalate into violence or harm and just try some stuff? Because if we're not willing to do that for each other and we allow it to be an exchange between two people, then yeah, it isolates us and it absolves us of that responsibility. So I say like, try it, and pull people in a conversation, put your body in the way, whatever feels right at that moment.
Serene?
This is less about perpetrators, but more about policy that might help with prevention. We need better sex education, and sex education that isn't just about, if you're lucky enough to get this kind, about how to not get a sexually transmitted.
The boys get the condoms, the girls say don't have sex. Yeah.
I mean, we need education about, people need comprehensive sex education about that, but also, I mean, we need to learn how to communicate about both what feels good to us and also how to ask other people about what feels good to them. Yeah. And people talk about needing to have conversations about consent, but really, like, that should be the minimum, right? I mean, consent should be the floor of any sexual interaction. Like, we want people to, and especially like when it comes to talking about children and adolescents, we want them to be able to engage in sexual interactions that are mutually pleasurable and even sometimes loving. But how can you do that if we are totally silent about that, and we're silent about it in education, and then sometimes we'll tell people that they need to seek consent without them even really necessarily being clear about what that entails. In some countries, sex education includes lessons about like how to write a letter to your partner, telling them about how you feel about them.
But someone is yelling at their TV right now saying, this isn't about sex education, this is about power. It's not about what happens when someone gets together and you're feeling each other. It's about someone exercising power over you.
So it is about people exercising power, obviously. I mean, I just don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, right? Mm-hmm. We live in a world where part of what it means to be socialized into a gender role is partly to learn to, like, that what it means to be a real man is to exercise certain kinds of power over other people. So yeah, it's about both sex and power, and I mean, because sex often becomes a tool of domination and we need it to not be that. So I'm not saying that sexuality is the only front where we should talk about this, but until people learn non-dominating ways of talking about and engaging in sexual communication with each other, this problem is gonna keep cropping up.
I think we also need to find ways to break down silos. Right, so there's a lot of work being done in different communities around different issues. And you know, the word activist sometimes is thrown around like it's something, you know, common to folks in movements. But if you look at the way that people are siloed, right? So I'll use myself as an example. I look at the work maybe I do around gentrification, around, you know, police violence or whatever, but I get so much support when I'm doing something like that because I'm breaking down those isms within those, you know, social justice movements. But whenever I say to my brothers, like, join me to talk about men's violence against women in some way, I don't get that same support. So, you know, the reason I say we throw around that word activist very loosely is because if you were there to, you know, break down those power structures that exist that hold people down, and if you're against the isms, then you will see violence against women as something else that you need to be there for. And what happens is that we're not true activists in a sense. A lot of us call ourselves activists, but we're really issuists. It's the issue that I care for. But then you're not really breaking barriers down. Because if you're breaking barriers down, you see the interconnectedness of how they all keep people suppressed. And if we're trying to create social change in our community, it begins with us saying, this is all a problem because systematically it all leads to the same thing.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and one way to break down that power structure or power barrier is to have survivors in the room. So when we're talking about policy, what's that quote that says, if you're not in the table, then you're in the menu? So if we're talking about policy, we have to have survivors in the room. If we're talking about sex ed, we have to have them in the room discussing their experiences, discussing what they've learned, and similarly in talking about restorative justice or transformative justice, right? What does accountability look like? If we're going to be, you know, opening our minds and thinking of it on our own, it's really, really difficult to do that work. So if you have board meetings, if you have, you know, policy changing that you're doing in terms of human resource, if you don't have a survivor in the room, or a client or anyone that you're working with to resolve this issue, then it's going to be really difficult.
I just kind of had a question about something that people have touched on, about like being an upstander and intervening. So I was wondering if you had any advice for young people, particularly teens, who might not have like as powerful a voice as an adult, might not have as much of an influence, or could even be like a little bit more vulnerable than an adult, and like being an upstander in situations of sexual harassment or violence that we see or hear about, without kind of like escalating the situation or like making it worse for ourselves.
Yeah, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing. We should have you in this panel. Yes, Womankind does a lot of work around educating community on what upstander is, what it means. And I think one small thing that I come out of it is knowing our own boundaries. So if we are going to step in that train ride, knowing what our boundaries are, and if we are survivors or if we have experienced violence, knowing what our triggers are and what we can do as much as we can, right? So it looks very different for everyone, depending on what power system you come from, what you identify as. So yeah, just learning about yourself, learning about your boundaries, and then choosing and picking things that make sense for you would be the first start.
Well, I'd remind you that there's some kids from Florida making a lot of noise right now. So I welcome any kid from Brooklyn, young person, to use their voice, because I suspect you could be much louder than a kid from Florida. But I have a great question that came in anonymously. To me, MeToo is not just about sexual harassment, but simply being a woman dealing with daily prejudices, catcalls, men mansplaining to us, etc. What can we do as women? The easy question of the night. What can we do as women in response to that?
As Tarana said in the video, a lot. It's about solutions. She wants action, and so I think it's about having conversations amongst folks who are gender minorities and gendered in a way, who are like non-masculine. So women, not just cis women, and cis means people who are born to like if I was born female, I move through the world as a woman, so I'm cisgendered. And there are people who are born with a specific biological sex who do not move within the world that way. And they can be trans or gender nonconforming. So folks who are the ones that experience gender-based violence, creating spaces and opportunities to like uplift each other and learn from each other and do stuff in numbers. Like, how are we learning in numbers? How are we isolating? How are we accompanying our friends along the journey of holding folks accountable? How are we creating healing spaces and really like not shaming ourselves, because we also internalize these systems. We also internalize sexism and transphobia and homophobia, and we inflict that harm on ourselves and on each other. And so I think that's important work for feminine people to do, is like, how are we perpetuating this against ourselves, and how are we like also forgiving ourselves and moving away from the shame that also is another level of harm.
So I have a question here that's very specific. Then what advice do you have for the segment of workers who don't have access to safe spaces like unions or worker centers? How do they report without repercussions unsafe work environments?
I just wanted to say, this is a comment that's in response to this question, but also to an upstanding or someone who wants to support someone else.
Right.
That is protected activity. So if you see someone else being sexually harassed and you complain about it, your employer is not legally allowed to take any action against you or take any action that would dissuade someone from complaining about that, because it's protected. So to answer that question, legally, they wouldn't be allowed to do it. There would be no repercussions that would be legal.
Right.
Now,
we know the law and the law.
But if they would retaliate, that would be,
right,
they would have a separate claim.
Gotcha.
And as would an upstanding in the workplace, or a woman supporting another woman who's being sexually harassed by an employer.
And I know, again, 311 is one point of
call
entry.
human rights. We really want, listen, we really want to go aggressively on a lot of these cases to make examples out of people who are doing this and are daring to do it, frankly, even right now, in the face of everything that's going on right now. I think, I mentioned the hearing that we had in December. We had it in December. That was, only 2 or 3 months following kind of the resurgence of MeToo. And part of what compelled us to do it so quickly was that we were also getting a lot of calls and queries from employers and from businesses saying, okay, we don't want to be the next, MeToo story. What are the best practices we should adopt? How should we react to these types of claims as they're coming out? So we wanted to put that together so that we would have the ability to put these stories together, consider different industries, and then in April we'll be actually coming out with the report from the hearing. So folks, check out our website at www.nyc.gov/human-rights, because we'll post the report there, and take a look at also at the website for other kind of materials on how do you report sexual harassment, how do you report other types of discrimination to city government. We want to be standing up there for you. We want to be taking on these cases. We've been working quite a bit on accessibility throughout the city so that, everybody in New York City can report claims of sexual harassment. Right. When I first got to the agency, we had 6 languages spoken across the agency. We now have more than 35. People can't report things if they can't communicate with government. We want you to be able to communicate with us. We want you to be able to call us.
So knowing that your report is coming out in about a month's time, I'm very fortunate that I can look at that report and have my eyes open, because I haven't had that personal experience. But since Me Too, I've been sitting at my desk at lunchtime, looking at these hashtags, looking at these stories with my mouth open half the time and just plain pissed off the other half. So what can someone like me do with that fire now, besides sitting at my desk and then getting distracted by the next thing? What are you going to make us do, leaving this room tonight, marching into the storm of the century? What should we do? Let's just in our last 4 minutes blow it up, ending mansplaining and toxic masculinity, light a fire under our ass. What do we do now?
Just to go back to what I have been talking about a lot, I think it's important to be an upstander and not a bystander, right? Find everyone in this room is every day privy to small forms of aggression against vulnerable people, also often privy to actions in the workplace that are, these small conversations that create an environment that say that some people don't belong there. Stop them. And it's really easy to stop them sometimes. All you have to do is to change the subject or start a conversation with someone else. You can also intervene more actively and explain that something, explain why what's going on is wrong. But sometimes that's, I mean, going back to your comment about boundaries, that's more than a person's ready to do. But you're already doing something.
So I'm changing the subject when you start. That's
yes,
it.
that's it.
In your face,
this is not,
no.
This
What's
is not
for
how
lunch?
we're bonding. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something else.
Maria.
I think, so one thing you can do is if you are a cisgender man, look at your phone list, call up all your guys, say, hey, we're gonna meet for pool, or we're gonna meet in your house. We're gonna talk about this, so come, because you can talk about everything else in the world. So we're gonna come and we're gonna talk about this. We're gonna talk about what it means for you. Are you Me Too? Are you not a Me Too? Have you experienced this? Have you witnessed this? And same thing goes for other identities and other groups of people, right? Creating those spaces wherever you are, whether it's lunchtime, whether it's outside of lunchtime, whether it's with your sisters or whether it's in a library, anywhere, right? So create those spaces, and you can easily do that. You don't need a lot to do that work. You can do it in your language. You can do it in your homes. So create those spaces wherever they are, especially cisgendered men.
So Maria, I'm looking at you now and thinking of people who everyone in the world, if you read a headline, is telling them that they have no power, they're at the will of whatever lawmaker is in office that time. How do you take action from that standpoint?
I would first say that's not true. Because if you're organized at your workplace, then you have more power than any employer. So my advice is get organized. You have the right to organize, regardless of status.
Right.
And if there are corporate policies that you think there should be, if there are corporate policies you're not happy about, then you have them in your collective bargaining agreement or whatever agreement that you get after you organize. You have to be organized. And this is why we work very closely with worker centers and unions.
Run right up into it. So get organized, even if it's 5 minutes in the subway before you guys hit the gate.
And change the policies yourself.
Give me 3 words.
Mobilize because oftentimes when the policy is in place, even still, there are people who, in self-defense, had every support and are then victimized and arrested and incarcerated for defending themselves, like Cece McDonald.
Once again, run right up into our time. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate the insights that you shared. The conversation will, of course, continue online. You can get us at brickartsmedia.org. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. We'll continue to fight and beyond Me Too. We're starting tonight and we'll keep it moving. Thank you all for being here.